Thanks for coming to listen to me this evening talking about the Alfred Jewel. So I'm a probationary research student, which means I'm in the first year of a PhD. And I'm researching Old English literature, specifically the use of wealth in a group of texts that are supposedly translated by Alfred the Great, who was the King of England in the 9th century. So this evening, I'm talking about how Alfred questioned what it meant to be a good king rather than a tyrant. Or in other words, how to be a hero rather than a villain, and how the use of wealth was central in this. So this is the Alfred Jewel, which is here in the Ashmolean, as Vicky said, on this floor. Some of you might have seen it this evening because I think that there's an interactive discussion going on with it. We call it the Alfred Jewel because of its inscription around the outside, which reads Alfred mec het Jurken, which translates as Alfred ordered me to be made. We think it was probably part of an astle, which is mentioned in the preface to one of the texts that Alfred supposedly translated, called the Pastoral Care. And the astle is probably a device used for reading and pointing. So this highly valuable piece would have accompanied the copies of the text that were sent round the country to Alfred's his men and his bishops as part of a widespread attempt to revive literacy and learning. And it's really interesting that the iconography of the Alfred Jewel is apparently linked to motifs of learning and wisdom, in that the large eyes of the figure here are meant to look like the eyes of the mind, the eyes used for seeking out wisdom. And it's worth thinking for a moment just about how significant it is that such a valuable item is linked to a text, to quite a plain text, and how it's used in quite a sort of mundane function of reading and pointing. I mentioned that the Pastoral Care is one of the texts that Alfred supposedly wrote, translated from Latin into Old English. The other texts include the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, which I'll be focusing on this evening, as well as Augustine's Soliloquies and the first 50 Psalms. There has been some doubt in recent years over the scholarship of these, the authorship of these texts, but many scholars still firmly believe that Alfred was behind them, and this is the line I take personally. So this is the Alfred that I'm mainly focused on, the Alfred who was interested in reviving learning and literacy and wisdom. But we're perhaps more used to this Alfred, Alfred the Hero, the military leader who led his men into battle. And if anyone saw the Last Kingdom on TV with Alfred the Great in it, this is the Alfred we saw there, who was fighting hand-to-hand with Vikings and was very much in the middle of battle. But they also showed him with his books as well, because he knew what the power of the written word was and how important it was that people could read and write. So this reveals a sort of different side to him as a hero. He's not just this military leader, he also understood the importance of learning. And the translations that he did, they reveal a side of him which constantly asks what it means to be a good man and to be a hero and to be a good Christian king. And we don't usually think about these heroes in this way. You don't think of them as being people who question and doubt what it means to be a hero. But his translations show that this is something which he was thinking about quite a lot. So the Old English Boethius is perhaps the best example of this. And this is a text I'll focus on this evening. So we call it this because it's by Boethius, who was a Roman, and it's the Old English version of his text, Consolatione Philosophiae, which is 6th century. So the text is a conversation between Lady Philosophy and Boethius, which becomes in the Old English wisdom and maud, which means mind in Old English. So we have two main copies of the text, one entirely in prose and one part prose, part verse. I'll be quoting from the one that's entirely the prose this evening. So this text has many examples of the way that kings and tyrants misuse the wealth and power that they've been given. And we can see here a sort of self-awareness on the part of Alfred about how misusing wealth is a difficult thing and a bad thing for a king to do. So this is the Old English, which I'll read aloud for you. What say you a whale donna and say you an wild, the you knew where ship hateth, if he becomes to them ailera, worse than men, and to them they his ailera and worth host bith. Swa he knew Judah to this Elkan Theodricha, and ik to Nerona, and Kesara, and off egg to Manium, Hera, Ilicum, who no wille he donna down, swa he duden, and yet doth, ale thou richu they him under beoth or the awa or neosta, for slayin and for herrian. And in case you don't know Old English, there's the modern English there, which I'll let you read in your own time. But we can see here that there's a real fear about what happens when wealth and power come into the hands of the wrong men. So Alfred's talking about Nero and Theodoric, who are two, what he thinks of as these bad kings who misuse the wealth that they've been given. So yeah, this is Alfred's take on the matter. But one of the differences between the original Latin text and Alfred's Old English version of it is that while the original author finds wealth hard to accept in any form, for Alfred, wealth is actually necessary for a king in order to carry out important works in the world. And part of my research is looking for these differences between the original Latin text and the text which Alfred makes in Old English. So a good example of this is in this one here, which you've got the Old English and Modern English beside one another to look at. So this is a good example of how Alfred adapts his source text, the Latin. So in the original, this is quite a small section, but Alfred expands on it in a big way. And he's saying that kings need to have money in order to do good things. So he's finding a way to make wealth useful, to make it into the tools that he mentions here and the materials, rather than letting it make him into a bad king or turn him into the tyrant that he fears so much. And as we saw, if you saw The Last Kingdom, as I keep referring to it, we could see there how Alfred was quite a humble man. They made him wear sort of quite plain clothes. He wasn't obsessed by money in any way. And this is the sort of the image of the king that we get from this sort of translation here. So by reading his texts, the translations, we can see his attempts to understand how to be a good Christian as well as a good king, how to use the wealth that was inherent in his position as a king in a good way, as a set of tools, rather than in the manner of the tyrants that he fears so much. So the early medieval Christian learning would have instilled in Alfred this idea that kingship was a duty and that he had a responsibility to God to carry it out well. And we can see this idea informing the attitude that a king needs to carry out these good works in the world. However, this overtly Latinate Christian learning was not the only thought that was current in the time. So Old English vernacular poetry existed during the reign of Alfred, before and afterwards as well. And so there's every possibility that he would have been influenced by the ideas in these poems. And one of the main genres of Old English literature is heroic poetry, such as Battle of Maldon and Beowulf, which people are probably familiar with. And a key trope of this poem is the giving of gifts from kings to his loyal men in order to ensure their loyalty. So this is a section from Beowulf. Så shall jungdomar goda jorkian, frommen förgiften on färre bärn, that hina on ilde eftiwinian, wilja stithos, donna wiakum, leodegalasten. And this is Seamus Heaney's translation. So he's stressing, this is a sort of section in Beowulf where the poet is stressing how a king has to hand out lavish gifts. And Heaney's translation sort of misses the point, I think, a little bit, because feogiftum is the word for a costly gift, and it's really emphasizing it has to be valuable, which he sort of misses out there when he translates it. So my question is, in my research, how does Alfred align this Old English heroic vernacular world where kings hand out lavish, costly gifts in order to ensure loyalty, with the world of the Christian Latin text that he translates, where wealth is allowed at some points, but very rarely encouraged as something that you should have in exchange. So for me, the answer lies in the Alfred Jewel, which brings us back to this lovely piece. So Alfred's combined gift of the Alfred Jewel and the copies of the translations of his Christian texts, the Pastoral Care, represents how he aligns these two types of kingship, the Christian and the heroic, at the same time using wealth well and not becoming the tyrant and the villain that he fears. So Alfred encourages Christian wisdom and learning through the gift of his vernacular texts and the translations, maintaining the heroic, the ideals of lavish gifts in the form of the Alfred Jewel, which would have been an incredibly valuable piece of workmanship at the time. And it's great that the iconography here represents the wisdom and learning that it accompanies the text itself. So Alfred uses his wealth well, rather than allowing it to make him into a tyrant. So the Alfred Jewel represents Alfred's careful consideration of the ethics of kingship, which is a different sort of heroism to that of his military leadership, his skills in the battlefield. But I think that this self-awareness of what it means to be a good king is what makes him into the great hero that we think of now. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and if I have any questions, I'll sort of be floating around. Thank you.